Hello, it's Aaron Wren, and my special guest today is Alexandra Hudson, who conveniently is my neighbor. She lives here in Indianapolis with me, and she's the author of the new book, The Soul of Civility, Timeless Principles for Healing Society and Ourselves. Lexi, thanks for joining. Maybe you could hold up the book so people can see what it looks like. I'll be sure to put a link in the show notes to buy the book if you would like. It's available wherever fine books are sold. So again, Lexi, thanks for taking the time to talk about your book.
Thanks, Aaron. Thrilled to be here. And I want to make an important clarification. We do live in proximity, but you were in Carmel.
Oh, right.
Not in
Yeah.
Indianapolis. And
okay, there we go.
anyone who knows Parks and Rec, there is you wouldn't call Pawnee Eagleton.
Yeah, Eagleton, yeah. Eagleton, exactly. Exactly. When I was thinking about reading your book about civility, before I even read it, here's the first thing that came to my mind. It seems to me that when people talk about civility, the people who talk about civility tend to be people who are in positions of power. They're kind of incumbent elites, and a lot of their talk about civility seems to be a way to essentially disenfranchise sort of less powerful people from being able to rock the boat. So when you talk about civility, what do you mean?
It's a great point. I think that, when we hear the word civility used today, it's often being weaponized, right? Deployed as a tool against someone who's engaging in conduct that someone deems undesirable and wanting to cease. But yeah, we do hear the word civility used a lot today, and yet everyone thinks they know what it means. And in fact, as I learned, no one does. I argue in my book that there's an essential distinction between civility and politeness. That politeness is manners, it's etiquette, it's external, where civility is internal. It's a disposition of the heart, a way of seeing others as our moral equals that sometimes requires being impolite, telling a hard truth, engaging in robust debate, engaging in modes of conduct that are befitting a member of the civis, a citizen in the city that is and has been an essential tool for promoting, justice and equity in our world. I have a whole chapter on civil disobedience in my chapter, exploring how this rich and vibrant tradition in American history has been a tool of affecting justice and equality in our world. And so it's a far cry from what many people think when they want to dismiss civility and politeness part and parcel as like just manners and tone policing and etiquette. Because civility is so much more than that, and it's essential for human flourishing across history and culture, and especially for the survival of a democracy.
You went back and looked at a whole lot of people throughout history weighing in on this topic. Who are some of the people that inspired you in thinking about civility?
I thought that grounding this book in the human tradition would lend some much needed clarity to this conversation that we're having in our own moment about civility. My book is about the most important question of our day. How do we flourish across deep difference? And I realized while writing this book that this is also the defining question of democracy, of the classical liberal project, but it's also, in addition to those things, the defining human question, and that people have in fact been grappling with this question of how to flourish even amid disagreement as long as we've been around as a species. So I draw from ancient Middle Eastern texts, medieval etiquette books, ancient Egyptian texts on civility. The oldest book in the world, for example, is a civility book given to us from ancient Egypt called the Maxims of Ptahhotep. I draw from Homer's Iliad, deriving insights there about timeless principles of civility and hospitality. I draw from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest story in the world about human nature and why there is this inherent tension between our love of self and love of others that is the defining human tension within our nature, and the defining tension of why civility is never a foregone conclusion in any time or place, including our own. And I wanted to do that to broaden the conversation. It's really easy to feel like our era is the most uncivil. And what I discovered while writing this book is that every era tends to feel that way. Every era tends to blame kids these days. Where are the manners of children? Which is so funny. Human nature doesn't change. It's not to say that there aren't important differences between.
There's nothing new under the sun.
That's right. As the book of Ecclesiastes says in Hebrew Bible, nothing new under the sun.
Yeah. So I am curious, really to hone on in on this role of kind of being a pain in the butt in civility. So, how would you analyze something like the civil rights movement in that framework?
Society needs gadflies. Society depends on gadflies for progress and for accountability. Socrates famously called himself a gadfly for his fellow Athenians. When he would walk around and ask people questions that they couldn't answer, he exposed ignorance, which Socrates is like, I'm doing you a favor, now you know where you want to grow. And people are like, no, I hate you. Like, let's force him to commit suicide. But so gadflies, sure, they're annoying, right? They're pains in the butt, as you mentioned, but they're essential for progress. Like the truth tellers, the prophets in a society are never, very rarely welcomed when they're being confronted by hard truths, ugly truths. I as I mentioned, I have a whole chapter in my book on civil disobedience. And I talk about Gandhi, I talk about Henry David Thoreau, I talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., all these people who took great personal risk upon themselves in order to speak hard truths to the societies that they were speaking to. In Henry David Thoreau's case, it was about the Mexican-American War and government, having a cavalier attitude towards American life. Gandhi, it was the oppressive nature of British colonialism in India. And with Dr. King, of course, it was the abhorrent injustice of racial segregation in the American context. And all of them are part of this vibrant tradition of peaceful nonviolent resistance, that there are effective means of pricking the conscience of a society, especially a Western democracy that claims to uphold a value of human life and human equality, and to engage in a method of action that is powerful. It's speaking the truth to power, but it's also crucially not undermining those values of basic human equality and human dignity along the way. For example, Dr. King knew that, and as did others, other abolitionists, from Frederick Douglass to William Lloyd Garrison, that they had confidence in the moral uprightness of their cause, of their strong belief in basic human equality, regardless of skin color, regardless of these external attributes. And yet they knew that even though they were totally in the right, they couldn't engage in a sort of ends justifies the means mentality, because that would undermine their fundamental belief in the basic human equality and dignity. They couldn't degrade the dignity of others along the way of pursuing basic human dignity and recognition and equality. And so that Gandhi has this great line, means matter. In fact, means are everything. He says means, like the instrument, the tools, the path you take to pursue a goal matters just as much, if not more, than the goal and nobility of the goal itself, which is that's such a good corrective for our current moment. That is so apocalyptic. It's very instrumental, right? Like, there are people on both sides of the political spectrum today that say the other side is too bad, too evil, too misguided to be respectful towards, to treat with dignity, to give the benefit of the doubt to, that we have to be willing to take the gloves off and do anything to win. And that is so dangerous. It's exactly the sort of apocalyptic, dehumanizing rhetoric that Gandhi, King, and others were very wary of.
Yeah, when I was reading that, I was thinking of a guy named A. Montgomery Ward, who was the guy that founded the old Montgomery Ward department store chain, probably before your day, that they all went out of business. But he was a wealthy guy in Chicago in the early 20th century, and he is the reason that the lakefront of Chicago is undeveloped and is open parkland. He really made himself a real pain in the butt. He filed tons of lawsuits, litigated to the Illinois Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, to essentially keep the Chicago lakefront forever free and clear of development. And we just don't have people like that today. It seems that there are two kinds of people. In the kind of like incumbent elites I mentioned, there's an almost Orwellian groupthink. I'll go to a conference, and 100% of the people there basically all are in agreement on all the big points. It's like North Korea. I mean, there's almost no dissent on a lot of issues. And then, the people who are sort of dissident, if you will, they tend to be provocateurs. And of course, the online world rewards people for being very provocative and stirring the pot and saying outrageous things. And so we don't really have, I think, that thing in the middle where somebody who's, call it a quote unquote respectable member of society, really starts bucking, their fellow elites in, a way that's like productive for making things happen.
That story reminds me of Jane Jacobs taking on Robert Moses, right? Like why we have, green pasture, why we have Greenwich Village, right? In New York City. And it's not a super freeway. I'm sure you're more familiar with that story than I am, but it sounds very similar. And I've had the same conversation with friends in kind of libertarian classical circles in England. Okay. Like they're very libertarian up until I say, well, what about London's beautiful public parks that are not high rises. They're not, parking lots for Russian Rolls Royces. Like they're beautiful, well manicured. And they're like, you know what? That's a great point. I do love our parks. Those aren't like totally subject to the free market. And there are people who have preserved these little oases, these public spaces that are essential for human flourishing and for just proximity and social trust and the good life.
Yeah. You got interested in this topic when you were working for the U.S. Department of Education. So my condolences on working in the federal government.
Thank you.
What was your experience there that made you hone in on this topic?
Rather miserable, I would say. I went in there with the best of intentions and the greatest optimism. I was like 23 years old, just out of grad school, and just out of a great experience working in local public policy and education at the state and city level in Wisconsin. I was in Milwaukee for a year. And I couldn't wait to put ideas into practice. And it was like my big break to have a small hand in making America's education better. And I couldn't have been more disillusioned or discouraged. And of course, I as I say in my book, the human condition is a human condition in all times, in all places, in all vocations, in all locales. And so I'm hesitant to paint any city or institution with a broad brush, right? Like I had a bad experience in politics in DC, yet those same human types exist here in the Midwest where you and I live, Aaron. Like I don't want
not in Carmel.
Okay, there you go. Maybe Carmel's well, if that's the case, then tell me why. The whole civility thing in Carmel. I know it's true. Like I thought Carmel was the last place in the world that needed civility, Aaron. But here we are. You're the first piloting program of the first civility city in America. We can talk about that a little bit after if you want. But anyway, so I saw these two extremes when I was in government. Broad extremes, of course, there are exceptions. But on one hand, there were people with sharp elbows who were hostile, bellicose, like aggressive. They were willing to step on anyone to get ahead. On the other hand, there were people who were polished and poised and polite, yet these are the people who would smile at me one moment, stab me and others in the back the next. And that latter contingent really perplexed me. And that helped clarify for me the perils of instrumentalizing others, because those two poles, the extreme hostility, extreme politeness, they seem like polar opposites, but they're actually very similar. They're two sides of the same coin. They see other human beings as means to one's selfish ends, as opposed to beings who are worthy of respect in and of themselves by virtue of our shared moral status as members of the human community. And then I hungered for a different mode of being that didn't fall into those two excesses, the extreme hostility or the extreme, tone policing and niceness and politeness. And that's how I came to appreciate, civility as this antidote to these extremes, that sees other people as a means, as ends in themselves, human beings worthy of respect just by virtue of being human, and that different from mere politeness actually requires telling hard truths and having uncomfortable conversations sometimes. But all that to say, when I was in government, I definitely had my vision of the good, of myself, of what I thought I wanted to do in the world, my confidence and my ability to coexist amid deep difference. All of that was tested and refuted. And I left government and zoomed out and thought, what does it mean to be human? What is the bare minimum of respect that we are owed and owed to others by virtue of our shared humanity? And what does that look like even when we deeply disagree? And that's kind of the moral foundation of civility that I unpack in the book.
It seems like today there's so little civility of any variety, however you want to define it. It almost seems hopeless. I mean, is anybody really interested in this, I guess, is a question. Or have we just simply made our peace with the Manichaean struggle or something?
So when I left government, I call myself a refugee from federal government. I came home from work one day and said to my husband, I'm done with DC. I'm done with politics. Let's move to Indiana. And Indiana is where my husband's from originally, from just outside of Fort Wayne. And so we moved here. And one of my first friends here is someone we both know. In fact, I think I met your wife first through this friend. Joanna Taft came up to me after church one day and said, "Hi, I'm Joanna. Would you like to porch with us sometime?" And I'd never heard the word porch used as a verb before, but we were curious and we didn't know anyone in town. So we went to her home that afternoon, and I realized that Joanna was staging a quiet revolution against our atomized and divided status quo on her front porch. And she had curated people across class, race, geography, and just to inhabit a shared space and to build friendship and to build trust that is so direly lacking in our world today. And I realized that for Joanna, it's not even that the porch is really a metaphor for that sort of way of life, of living your life wanting to transform outsider to insider, stranger into the friend. And when I was a Novak journalism fellow, I had the privilege of traveling the country, finding Joanna Tafts everywhere. People who, with and without porches, are doing the same way, staging the subversive, quiet revolution of people reclaiming their civic sphere, saying, I cannot control what is happening in Washington. I can't control, what the primary debate, what's happening there, who's tweeting what, or what the scandal of the day is. But I can control myself, and I'm going to make my community better and stronger right where I am. And so I met people who were doing this, from local coffee shops, like holding office hours. And that was just like a place where people knew they could come and be seen and known and loved. I met people who have weekly supper clubs or live in cities and do this from their front stoops, or, just make it a practice of reaching out and reaching to the stranger and inviting the stranger into their lives. And that's really the ethos of true civility and hospitality, which I call a high and noble expression of civility. And the beauty and interesting facet of this is that it can't be legislated. No national policy can be rolled out and mandate that people porch and invite people into their homes, right? Like, that'd be crazy. It has to be voluntary, it has to be spontaneous, it has to be organic. And so I hope people walk away from reading my book feeling empowered, that, while the world wants to disempower us, this moment wants to make us feel helpless, and it wants to disempower us, empower us by blaming others. If we're blaming someone, we're helpless. But in fact, I try to invert that, inspired by Joanna and others that I talk about. I talk about Confucius, an original portrait from ancient China. I talk about Albert Schweitzer, the Alsatian German philanthropist who said, everyone needs their own Lamborghini, their own little oasis that they create, that they make better and more beautiful. And that, like, there are portraits across history and across culture who have said, I want the world to be different, but I can only change myself. And I'm going to try to change the world by changing what I can control. And we can revive that tradition and do the same.
Yeah, it's sort of almost like a localist vision. The Front Porch Republic, I'm sure you're familiar with them. They kind of are very into that sort of thing. Joanna's interesting. She actually did introduce my wife and I to each other.
Oh, fun.
She's what I call an Uber connector. And so
Yeah.
if you're at her church on a Sunday morning, she's like scanning the crowd. And if she sees anyone that looks new, she makes a beeline for them, introduces herself, and makes a point to get them connected, not just to people in the church, but to anyone else in the community that she knows through her network. And it really makes a huge difference. I've said there's a lot of institutions that, people join a church or they join something and it's like they can't meet people. They have trouble connecting. And I do think these like Uber connectors, people who make it their business to, engage newcomers, make connections to people is like really an important role that is out there.
So it's so funny. We can say that in the abstract, Aaron, that like, yes, super connectors, they're important. They make the world go round. And yet Andrew Sullivan had me on his podcast last week, and he utterly recoiled at the zealous extroversion that I kind of like elevate as this like ideal in my book. He's like, that's, like having someone in my home. Like he's such a cynical curmudgeon, but like it's really easy to be like, yeah, that's good for other people, but like, not good for me. And that's okay. Like, I'm not saying that you have to welcome every single person into your home, or you're not a good citizen if you're not having dinner parties and porching. Like this is it. Joanne is exceptional, and my mother is exceptional. My grandmother, before my mother, is exceptional. They go above and beyond. In this way, and they in the case of my grandmother, I unpack this concept of the mellifluous echo of the magnanimous soul, which is the power of one magnanimous soul, one like deeply well composed individual. This is like Aristotle's concept of soulish magnanimity, that you're basically so put together that you can be utterly self-forgetful and focused on others and your avenue of life. So was my grandmother. And my grandmother lived her life like Joanna does, according to this otherworldly logic of just like seeing needs and filling them, seeing loneliness and meeting it, and just wanting to breathe life and light and kindness into people's day. And, we are all familiar as students of public policy, and people watch the news. I don't watch the news, but like headlines are still dominated by stories of generational trauma and vicious cycles. Like one person's addiction, one person's, selfishness and that it reverberates across time. It hurts themselves. It hurts people around them. It hurts generations after them as well. But we insufficiently tell stories of the inverse, or appreciate the power that the inverse is also true. That one person, through their grace, through their zealous extroversion, through their magnanimity, can create with their lives a virtuous cycle, what I call a mellifluous echo, a beautiful echo that reverberates and blesses and brings light and life across time and across place for generations after them. And that we tell stories like this, and I choose to, precisely because it's exceptional, but also deeply ordinary. Like it's powerful, but we can also, choose to elevate our lives and how we interact with others in the small ways too. And there are there's deep power in that as well that we vastly underappreciate.
Yeah, in terms of the practicalities of civility, you talked about hospitality and some of that, but you sort of a hint, I think, in your last thing you said, the role of forgiveness, which you mention in the book as well. It makes me think of Hannah Arendt and her writings about the role of forgiveness in human affairs, and where does forgiveness come in as a practical guide to, or a practical way to be civil?
It's so interesting you say that, because I think there is an enormous amount of bitterness in our world. Like these recent political battles of recent years, recent decades, has taken its toll. And I have a whole chapter in my book on forgiveness. It's my final chapter on misplaced meaning and forgiveness. And I recount this poem, William Blake's. It's called The Poison Tree. And I don't have it memorized, but he basically tells a story about, he says, I was angry at my friend, and I buried that anger, and I shot my friend or something like that. And then he says, and then I was angry at my friend, and I vented to my friend, like I came forward about like the anger, and there was harmony and there was bliss. And I think it's a really important insight into like social psychology, that I think the human heart longs for openness and healing and forgiveness and reconciliation. Like I think at its ideal, when there is a rupture of trust, that at its best, the two parties come together and there's mutual acknowledgement of the wound and mutual offering and receiving of forgiveness. I think that's at its best. Even if it's not saying, I'm sorry, even if one person didn't actually do anything wrong, like saying, I'm sorry this happened. Like you can apologize in a general way that still can promote kind of the unity after a rupture. And so I think that's the ideal, that reconciliation where two parties come and are equally humble, equally as committed to the restoration. But even if that's not possible, like in the case of a very belligerent party, or in the case of death, right? There are many different circumstances in which like mutual reconciliation is not possible, that you can still forgive. And that when you forgive, you're actually freed of this unbelievable like burden. People insufficiently appreciate the heaviness and the toxicity that unforgiveness comes with. And I'm talking from this as a personal experience, because I'm someone, I joke in the book, like maybe it's the Irish in me. Like I have a hard time letting go sometimes. I really do. It's like, it's like I've accepted this narrative that there's more power in remembering than there is in moving on and living my best life. It's a very seductive, very pernicious story. And I wrote that chapter very much, as much to myself as to anyone reading it. So
it reminds me, my mother's family is Sicilian. There's a Sicilian saying to the effect of, if I die, I'll forgive you. If I live, I'll kill you.
That's right.
And that's sort of the way. One of the things you say is that you should try to become unoffendable. And I don't know that any of us can be unoffendable, but the idea of just deciding to take less offense when people do things is there. My little trick I try to do, and is one day I was getting ready to pull into a parking spot downtown Indianapolis. So, I pull up and I put on my turn signal, and this woman in a small car zips in and just grubs into the spot. And of course, and when I lived in Chicago when I was younger, that would have been like, it would have been like an incident. But what I said to myself is, and maybe this is a bad attitude, I'm like, you know what? People who do that live the sort of life that people who do that get. It doesn't lead you to a good place to be someone who's like out there trying to steal people's parking spots. And so it's like, it's like some of these actions have they come with their own consequences, and there's no reason for me to get too crazy about it, because I could just circle the block and find another parking spot and not allow that to get to me,
One little technique that I do that brings me great joy and like vents in a healthy way, I think, is I imagine, what would Larry David do in this situation? And I get this like little voyeuristic pleasure as I imagine, you're sitting in the car, Aaron, cursing this person who just like, took your spot. And then just take a minute, be like, what would Larry David do? He'd get out and be like, excuse me, sir, this is society. I was clearly her first. You came in, like you are rupturing this very fragile and precarious social project. Like, go back and find your own spot. I just kind of like roll out this. Yeah. And of course, how I just described it is much more decent and less colorful than how Larry probably would have approached this. But Larry David, for anyone listening that doesn't know, is the creator of Seinfeld, and has his own fabulous spin-off show, Manners, called Curb Your Enthusiasm, that I'm a huge enthusiast for. I argue in my book that Larry David is the foremost defender of civilization, that, this peer-to-peer accountability of him calling people out for double parking, for stealing parking spots, for not returning their shopping carts, right? Like, civilization is held together by the small things, by people's willingness to make small sacrifices for the sake of living with others. And to the extent that we don't do that, like, society unravels, and we don't appreciate that. So Larry David's the world underappreciated today, and also a great kind of like psychological technique to get satisfaction like that. That person will get his comeuppance. Were Larry David ever king of the universe?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Again, my guest today, Alexandra Hudson. She's the author of the book, The Soul of Civility: Timeless Principles for Healing Society and Ourselves. Again, the link to it will be in the show notes. And Lexi, thank you so much, and good luck with the book.
Thanks, Aaron. Great to be here.